Hello, good people. I appreciate the double entendre. When people ask me who I spoke to today, I will tell them I spoke to the good people. And I will feel good and honest about that. How's everybody doing? Are we having a good conference experience so far? Give yourselves a round of applause. A round of applause for having the courage and bravery to stand up for the things that are going to make American civil society, culture, and really the landscape of everything that we do together as a community and a nation better for today, tomorrow, and for generations to come. I know that conference experiences can sometimes seem a little bit rote, but when I come to a place like this, I am inspired by how many and how deep the cause and the motivation is for people who are dedicating their lives to so many different causes that the country needs people to be engaged in. And so I want to extend my profound gratitude to each of you for allowing me a moment or two to say a little bit about the things that draw me to be in your company here along those lines. In the environment that we live in, though, in the environment that each of you work, and in the larger environment of American culture, American politics, the environment that we find ourselves working through today is one that is largely defined by the divisions that exist between us. And that is a deep and heartbreaking thing for those of us who seek to work in collaboration with people who exist across the divides of political opinion and cultural identity. And so I want to say a little bit about that dynamic of American life because it has implications for each of us as we move forward in the work that we wish to do in American civil society and in the causes that we hold dear. So as was mentioned, I'm national ambassador for an organization called Braver Angels. And to say just a little bit about that very quickly, it is America's largest grassroots, cross-partisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization in American society. And while we have work that extends from the United States Congress to state houses to 100 local alliances and college campuses across America, our work began in the act of bringing people together at community meetings and kitchen tables to speak and humanize each other across their differences. Basically, it was marriage counseling for the relationship between Republicans and Democrats. That's where it began. Something, the kind of intervention our country seems to be very much in need of these days. Now, what feels like a former life for me sometimes, I myself was once upon a time a Republican nominee for Congress. As a matter of fact, I was the youngest Republican nominee for Congress, I think the youngest nominee for Congress, period, in the state of California back in 2014. And at the age of 26, whether I was speaking to a liberal black church in South Central Los Angeles or a conservative white Tea Party club in South Bay LA County, people would ask, what at your age makes you qualified to represent a district as diverse and complex as the California 43rd? And I'd tell them, well, I have an interesting family background. You see, my mother is a liberal black Democrat from inner city LA. My father is a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my mother to my father and my father to my mother, and that's why I can represent all of you, right? And it tended to be good for a laugh. The thing about our politics, though, is that politics these days is about more than differences of opinion, more than polarization in the classical sense. The culture wars, to use that phrase, represent an identity crisis in the body politic. The problem isn't so much that we disagree on issues. The problem is oftentimes that we define our identities in opposition to one another. And so I think that the reason my framing of myself in those biographical terms had power is because consciously or unconsciously, we recognize the fact that this isn't just a clash of opinions, but it can feel like a clash of identities. Now, there's a history to this. If we go back in time, we will find people talking about sort of the golden age of Walter Cronkite, an era of bipartisanship in the mid-20th century, where you could be a Republican, you could be a Democrat, but it didn't necessarily have to be a big deal. The parties had conservatives in the Democratic Party, liberals in the Republican Party, and political affiliation didn't seem to be the thing meaningfully dividing people. But then came the social changes of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, a movement in which the progressive forces of change of American society mobilized in favor of social justice and equality. The conservative movement, meanwhile, joined stream with the evangelical movement in American society, and suddenly Republican politics came to be rooted in deep religious conviction, traditional rural cultural affiliations, and of course, a deep sort of Christian sense that America culturally could only be in integrity with her history if she were to identify that religion as the bedrock of her foundational identity. And so, in contrast to the way politics had worked before, as we come out of the 1960s and 1970s, we find ourselves in a landscape where if I know your race, if I know your sexual orientation, if I know your religious attitude, I have a pretty good inkling as to whether or not you vote Democrat or Republican. It didn't used to be that way before, but now we find ourselves in a period of time where cultural identity winds up being the dividing line between us in so many different ways. And this makes things far more complicated in terms of how we navigate politics and disagreements, not just in terms of voting, but in terms of how we engage our institutions and our organizational cultures. And it makes something plainly evident, which is the fact that if we cannot hear each other across the gulf of our personal or lived experiences, if you will, and create environments in politics and in organizations where we can hear one another as human beings, we will fail to be able to make space for generative collaboration across the differences that divide us. When I was a young person going to school in Culver City, California, what once upon a time was the fourth most diverse school district in America, I think, there was a young black woman in a class that I was in, English class, who refused to stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. And when asked by our English teacher, why not? She said, why would I stand and salute a flag of a country that has oppressed and persecuted my people from slavery to the present day? I will not do that. I will not honor that history because that history has been an offense to me as a black woman. And this was when I was probably 13 years old. But I know that that young woman then would have seen herself represented in Colin Kaepernick when he took a knee in response to the call to salute a flag of the United States of America against the backdrop of police brutality against people of color in the streets. Not an experience everybody has a sensitivity to, but one that is real, that we can observe. At the same time, I can go back a few years before that, and I can remember a young boy who came to our progressive school from rural Tennessee when I was in the 4th grade. And this was a kid who spoke with a Southern twang. He was a kid who wore plaid shirts. He was somebody who didn't fit in with the rest of us. And like many immigrant students coming to our school, he found himself teased and alienated because of the sound of his voice and because of a cultural identity that we were unfamiliar with, but somewhat in contrast to that the immigrant students who would join our school, he didn't receive a special invitation, a special introduction from our faculty. He didn't receive special considerations to allow him to acclimate and adjust. It was assumed that he was an American, he would fit in just fine, but truth be told, he culturally was alienated and isolated from the rest of us in our multicultural progressive environment. And I don't know what happened to that young man, but if at some point he put on the red cap in support of a new political movement that said to him, you have been alienated by the mainstream of liberal society and we will fight for you, I will understand where that came from in his experience, because he did experience that cultural alienation, even as a person from rural America who you might think of as having inherited the promises and privileges of this country, but who felt himself out of step with the culture that surrounded him in my multicultural progressive community. Now, in my life, what I have come to understand is that good people who do not understand one another oftentimes fail to see the good in each other. And when we fail to see the good in each other across the gulf of our experiences, we fail to make space for one another to show up in the fullness of our identities. But when we can show up in the fullness of our identities, we can make space for discovering the common ground that exists between us on the basis of values that we still hold in common. Conservatives and Republicans look at social change in a way that is different from the way liberals and progressives oftentimes look at it. Progressives oftentimes look at the idea of social change in a way that echoes with the substance of the word progress. It's a matter of moving forward, innovating, advancing bold new solutions to long-standing issues, and not being chained by the shackles of the past. Conservatives, on the other hand, oftentimes look at the social good as being a function of adhering to a tried and true order. The conservative philosophy itself comes from the idea that we live in a world that is ordered with intentionality by the divine hand of God, if you will. That if you live your life in a certain righteous way, it will produce good effects in the world. And so it's a matter of being faithful to what has been received from the past, as opposed to always trying to change towards the future. But it doesn't necessarily mean that conservatives are opposed to change. It means that the heart of conservative philosophy, in principle, should be about not wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so I've lived in South Central Los Angeles for my entire adulthood. I grew up with family in the hood. I grew up with family in the suburbs. I found myself traveling around the world socioeconomically, even while I didn't travel a whole lot geographically as a young person. And as an adult, what I have found is conservatives who are willing to work in the most marginalized and hard-hit communities from a moral foundation that can look different from where social liberals are coming from, where progressives are coming from, but comes from a place that suggests the possibility of common ground. I worked with a nonprofit organization in inner city Los Angeles that focused in on rehabilitation, stewarding at-risk youth, helping people find their way off of drugs and off of chemical dependency. But what motivated them was not so much a desire to change the world according to a certain program or intervention. They were living in accordance with their religious faith, what they felt to be the teachings of service exemplified by the gospel, exemplified by the teachings of the Bible. I sat on the board of directors for a school in South Los Angeles called Strive, Arts and Academics, not founded by religious conservatives, but founded by people who, like many conservatives, believe in this idea that you build locally in ways that produce self-reliance, that teach people how to be able to trust themselves and their own labors, and from that to be able to build structures of education that can be of service to the young people in their neighborhoods. Well, these are not things that any progressive or any liberal who cares about community and who cares about neighborhood and country would have any opposition to, even if we come from different starting points in our cultural experiences. And so the question becomes, in the midst of the culture wars, how can we create the space to listen to one another to where we can show up in the fullness of our cultural and religious and political identities while still speaking in a way that identifies those avenues for common ground? At Brave Our Angels, part of what we teach is the value of listening, not to respond, but listening to understand and then to acknowledge people's positions in terms that they themselves can recognize as representing what they genuinely think and feel. And so if we were having a conversation across the line, such as abortion, no more controversial topic, there may be people, of course, who have a cynical approach to that issue on the right, but many people on the right would at least think of themselves as not wanting to control what a woman does with her body, but they actually think that the life of the unborn is sacred. And so in articulating back to them, well, this is my understanding of your point of view. I may not agree with it, but I understand you're coming from a place where you wish to defend life. In seeking to create relationships of connection across these sorts of issues, if we can listen to one another in a way that allows us to repeat back to each other the substance of what we believe in the terms that we believe it, we create the space for actually hearing one another. And similarly, as we collaborate across organizations that may be coming from different points of view, what we try to do at Brave Our Angels is to create the space for us systematically identifying the values that we have in common. And so it may not be the fact that we agree on politics or policies or every possible solution, but if we agree on the need to upend poverty in America, if we agree on the need to create safe communities, if we agree on the first principles of how we engage in collaboration together in terms of the moral outcomes we want to see in America, we create the space for us to be able to trust one another as human beings on the basis of the intentions that we hold in common. Because the work of creating the beloved community is the work of creating trust on the basis of goodwill between those who are different. And if we can do that, we can achieve the aims of the beloved community for the United States of America and across the landscape of American civil society and for all of the causes that you hold dear. And I am here to tell you that we can do this if we believe in this pathway as a people in this country, as good people who wish for the common good of all. And so with that, I thank you very much for giving me this moment to share with you, and I'm glad to be here with you. Thank you so much.